Today's exercise is to paint a picture of the Pantheon at Stourhead, which is a National Trust property in the UK. The Pantheon is or has a backdrop of some wonderful trees, and in front of it there's a lake. There are various photographs that we could choose. This one here is quite a typical one. We've got this lovely Palladian bridge in front, but looking at that I just feel that the bridge itself could cause a bit of a problem. You either do the bridge in detail, in which case that becomes the focal point and the Pantheon loses out, or you do the Pantheon as the focal point, and then the bridge then needs to be carefully considered. Anyway, I just felt there were just too many problems there, perhaps, to overcome. There's another photograph of the Pantheon from across the water. This one's quite nice. It's got a little jutting headland here with a tree and so forth. So that one could be quite nice to do. But the one that I did sort of settle on was this one here, which is a fairly close photograph of the Pantheon with some nice trees around it. But the trees, it'd be very easy for these trees, because they're so the greenery there is so dark, for them to take over the picture, and you've got this lovely light green lawn in front. And so I decided to do this, but change the season perhaps and go for some autumnal trees, rather like these and these two photographs, with more yellows and oranges as well as the greens. So that's the sketch with the Pantheon, waterfront reflection, and then the tree shapes vaguely put in place. I'm using 200 gram cold press Langton paper in a sketch pad, and the colours I'll use will be mainly lemon yellow, cad yellow, burnt sienna, burnt umber, cobalt blue, and maybe a bit of violet as well. So the first job is to just establish a bit of sky and the water, and as always what I want to do is to trap the light, especially on the water. If you copy this photograph, which has got a lot of darks in the water, when you come to do your painting you'll find that these darks will basically kill the painting off. And we don't want that to happen. We want to try and capture as much light on that water as we possibly can. This top picture here, nice blue water, nice blue sky, lighter areas in the water, which is great. But again, if you painted that exactly as the photograph, using that amount of blue over the whole of the water, you would shut the painting down. You've got to be very careful about how much blue you use. What I tend to do is have a nice light blue for the sky, making the sky, if it's big enough, slightly warmer at the top, which is closer to the viewer's eye, and do the same with the water. So the water towards the background is quite light, if not entirely white, making it warmer as it comes towards the front. And by doing so, you trap the light in that middle area. Okay, so I'm going to start by wetting the sky area and the trees, because I want to have some of the trees open so that you can see some of the sky through them. Work roughly around the building itself, come down and then wet the water as well, including the reflection. Now that just allows us to paint without any hard edges, and it gives us a bit of time as well to get our colours on. So I'm going to start off with some cobalt blue, quite light in tone, just to give me a little bit of sky colour, nothing too much. And bring that down nice and light over the trees. I'll come back to that in a minute and just maybe put a few darker streaks. Do the same with the water, leaving the water close to the the land there, light. In fact, making it almost white, just up there. We're getting warmer and warmer, putting in these sort of wavy streaks towards the bottom, and making it quite a bit darker towards the bottom, and that gives us this sort of ripple effect, and helps to draw the eye in. Just getting slightly stickier as we come through. A slightly smaller brush. Using cobalt blue again, just put in some slightly darker areas just to break the sky up a little bit. Don't want it to be too fussy. And similarly, the same down here, where that's beginning to dry a bit. Just reinforce that. You could also put a little bit of ultramarine blue in the water down here as well, because that's a warmer blue and helps to take the eye in. Okay, but I've left it quite streaky. So the next stage is to work on the trees. I'm going to make the trees quite bright, using some nice yellows and oranges and reds and so forth, sort of autumnal colours. But I'm going to start off with the trees which are close to or right up beside the Pantheon itself. The Pantheon is largely white, and therefore it's going to be the dark of the trees around it which give the Pantheon its shape. So I'm just going to start on those trees beside the Pantheon, and at the same time paint the Pantheon itself too, so the two sort of go together. And there's a nice, in the photograph that I'm looking at anyway, there's a nice yellow bush tree close by, so I'm going to start with that, make it slightly yellower. So I'm starting off with lemon yellow. One colour I didn't mention, I was giving the list of colours I'm going to use, was a green, and for that I'm going to use the Daniel Smith colour, the green Appetit Genuine, which is great. But you could use lemon yellow, sorry, not lemon yellow, sap green, or perhaps hooker's green would be okay for that. So that started. Okay, now you can use some cad yellow just to darken that out, or this is actually Indian yellow, which is I'm working wet into wet. And now I'm going to go straight in with this lovely Daniel Smith colour, the green Appetit Genuine, and it's going to help me define the outside shape of the Pantheon. Let it mingle with the yellows I put on. Define the shape of that dome there. Okay. As you can see, my sort of brush stroke is sort of dotty because of the foliage. And when you've got a light coloured object, the more you put darks beside it, the more you define the shape. So there you can see already we're beginning to cut the shape of the Pantheon almost out of the paper by using fairly dark tones. It fascinates me actually that you can get a painting to a certain stage where you can almost just leave it as it is. So I mean, I put a few tones, a few colours into the Pantheon itself. Now you can almost just leave that as it is, and it would be a relevant painting. You don't always have to go too far. A bit more dark down there below the trees. Okay, that's fine. I'll come back to that again later on. So we're beginning now to define the actual subject itself, the focal point, which is the Pantheon. The sort of little headlandy or island bit that it lives on is quite a nice light green. So I'm using lemon yellow there just to get that started. Then drop a bit of the green into front bit. Don't make that too dark. All the time I'm looking at the focal point, the subject, which is the Pantheon in this case, and just making sure that whatever I put on beside it doesn't take away from it but adds to it. I think in the case of the darks beside it, for the foliage and so forth, that works okay. Now, whilst we're doing the lawn work and the Pantheon and so forth, I'll also do a little bit of the reflection in the water. This is fairly crudely put in. The reflections, in theory, should be darker than the object themselves, but you've got to be careful with that. As I said before, if you make the reflections too dark, then that can overtake the object itself. In some cases, in some paintings, that's a requirement, that the reflections become the painting. But for most paintings, you want to make sure that the focal point remains just that. Okay, so just making the reflections more dotty, more streaky. Because they are in the water. So I'm putting in horizontal strokes. Leaving some gaps just to, and letting it come over the side of the reflection of the Pantheon itself. Okay, that's fine. Or down there perhaps. Good. I'll come back to the side a little later on. I'm going to let that dry. Now I could carry on with the trees over here. I'll do. But I think I'll do that in a second. As I said before, I'm going to do this greenery here and the Pantheon at the same time. So the Pantheon itself is largely cream or white in colour, and therefore a lot of the actual shape of it, the painting of it, excuse me, will be in the form of shadows and so forth. Behind these columns, you've got a fair amount of shade there. Of course, the dome itself is slightly darker. And it's a three-dimensional thing, so I wanted just to decide where the light's coming from. I'm going to say that the light's coming from the right-hand side here, which means that the left-hand side, which, well, there's not much of it showing, will be in shadow. Now, I want to make it quite warm and bright, so my shadow colour, I'm going to use a little bit of violet. It's the quinacridone violet from Daniel Smith, to which I add a little bit of burnt umber. So I'm going for a shadow colour at the moment. It's the one colour that I very often do mix on a palette, and a little touch of cobalt blue as well, just to grey it down slightly. And just start dropping that in. To get that shadow. So here I'm just softening the bottom of it with some water. Shadow side of the columns. A shadow up there. So really, as I say, virtually the whole thing is going to be defined by shadow. It's got a grey roof, so I'm going to use a bit of cobalt and burnt umber for that. Okay, so just do the roof. The roof is sort of almost completely cobalt with perhaps just a little touch of burnt umber. Too much. So it's slightly bluey grey, but with white. Maybe just a little bit too dark there, although this is the shadow side, so that's okay. the area just in front of the Pantheon is a darker green, so and then I want some darker marks just to help define the shape of the Pantheon a little bit more. So I'm using a very fine brush and cobalt and burnt umber just to help some of these areas stand out a little bit more. There's a doorway you can see just here. So I'm virtually drawing with the brush now. And I think that's most of the work on the Pantheon done. We'll see, might come back to that. But whilst we've got those colours in the palette, we can of course just do the reflection too. Or at least parts of the reflection. Come back to that and put a little bit more detail where necessary and blend it in a little bit more with the other work around. I just want to get those established whilst we have those colours on the palette. So that'll do just for the moment. Okay, so I'm going to continue with the rest of the trees, finish this lawn bit on this side, and the reflection there too, and then we're fairly well on our way. This piece of land here, I'm going to start that off with a little bit of Indian yellow, or say you might have cad yellow. Use a bit of white green with it. Don't be afraid of leaving white gaps between different objects. You can make a painting look much more interesting if you do that. whilst we're working in that area, I'll just establish the water line. So burnt umber, bit of green, quite dark. Make it a continuous line, just break it there, here and there, push it up a little bit. And I tend to leave a little bit of a white gap between its reflection and the actual object itself in the water. I'll come back to that a little later on and put a few flicky bits in there perhaps. Now this land here in the photograph is actually darker than the lawn area, but I'm going to reverse that because I don't want that to come forward too much. So let's just start off nice and light with some lemon yellow. And then some lemon yellow and the green. Shade greener, oops, a bit too much perhaps, as we come closer to the waterline. And whilst we're there, just a little bit of burnt umber and the green to help establish the water, where the water comes to. And again we'll do that, do its reflection at the same time, using the same colours, quite light. And we can look at these trees over here. I want these to be nice and bright, and as I mentioned before, I want to use more autumnal colours, so sort of yellows and the reds. So for this one's just here, I shall start off with cadmium yellow, and I leave more cadmium yellow when I come to put the other colours on at the top of the tree, because that's where most light is hitting. And I want them to be quite red and autumnal. I'm not really referring now to the photographs at all. I'm just doing what I think will make a nice picture. I'm not going to reflect too much of these top trees, these distant trees, into the water, because I don't want to lose too much of the light that's there. So going to use the burnt umber, and maybe a little bit of burnt umber mixed with a little bit of red as well, a little bit of cad red perhaps. Just brighten it up, change the colour a little bit. get darker towards the bottom where there's less light. And then mix a bit of it with burnt umber. So I've got burnt sienna, burnt umber, towards the bottom. And because the light's coming from the right hand side of the trees will be that little bit darker too. Just use a little bit of light green, some of those background trees. And flick in some trunks and branches with burnt umber and a little bit of green. And do this. I'm doing this whilst the stuff I've already put in is still wet. Maybe use a finer brush. And use burnt umber just to make sure that they're well planted in the ground. As this dries, just drop a little bit more sticky burnt umber and burnt sienna into it, just to bring those trees forward a little bit. And for these background trees, I'm going to use a little bit of my green, but quite light, on top of the yellow, the lemon yellow. So I'm just working on some of these reflections. Don't want to make them too dark. Just putting them on mainly with horizontal strokes, leaving some gaps, just to hint that they're there. fine. And I want a little bit here to reflect these. So I'm not going to reflect those trees too much, as I mentioned before, but I will have some reflections in there, just a little bit. So starting off with a lemon yellow. And then just a little bit of light green. Putting that in with horizontal strokes. I'm going to let that dry. So I'm just going to put in a few branches and tree trunks for some of these trees towards the back here. Bit of green. Stop. Start. So I'm just putting in a few branches and tree trunks for some of the trees at the background here. Not too much. Already I can see that's getting a little bit over the top. So what I'll do is carry on and then just take some of them off with a little damp tissue. And you don't want continuous branches or trunks, so stop and start. And don't go right to the top of the greenery. Just establish a few marks there. Just soften some of these now, where I put them on a little bit too dark. And I might use that same colour again just to flick in a few reeds and so forth. And then I'm going to use cobalt with a bit of burnt umber just to put in some ripple lines. Not many, you don't want it, they want to be quite short. What they tend to do is tie the reflections up. It's fine. And then what I also do is the same thing again, but this time with white gouache. just helps to give that enhanced water effect. So that's my painting of the Pantheon at Stourhead, more or less finished. One or two things I've added, just to show you. I've warmed up the shadow areas on the building. They just looked a little bit too grey, and for that I used a violet and the cobalt blue together, and just warmed those up. I've added a few more blue streaks. I've also added a little bit of splatter using the burnt sienna and some white, but that's entirely up to you. I feel that it helps to make the picture look more lively and helps to bind things together. So in conclusion, with this sort of painting, remember, always go for contrast. So we've got the light of the building with the dark around it, and that contrast really helps to establish the focal point, and brings that part of the painting, which is where you want the eye to go to, brings it forward. And I built up the painting just making sure that everything that I put in doesn't compete all the time with the focal point. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. I've enjoyed painting it, and I hope that your own artwork goes well. Thank you very much for watching.